He had worn the same uniform for more than a decade. Every morning when he buttoned it up and pinned the badge over his chest, he felt a strange kind of comfort. It wasn't just a piece of metal to him, it was power. It was a reminder that he mattered, that people respected him, that when he spoke, others listened. He liked that feeling, maybe too much. In his city, everyone knew him. When he walked into a cafe, the owner would rush to greet him. Drivers pulled over as soon as they saw his patrol car in the mirror. His neighbors nodded to him with polite smiles. To them, he was the man who kept the streets safe, who faced danger so they could sleep peacefully at night. He carried that reputation like armor, but under that armor was a man who had slowly started to believe that the rules didn't quite apply to him. It started with little things: a parking ticket dismissed for a friend, a warning instead of a report for a business owner who owed him a favor, a free meal here and there from people who wanted to stay on his good side. None of it seemed wrong at first. After all, he told himself, he deserved it. He worked hard. He saw things others didn't want to see: broken families, crime scenes, accidents that haunted him long after he went home. He convinced himself that a few shortcuts were harmless rewards. Over time, that sense of entitlement grew. He began to talk down to people, even those who had done nothing wrong. When he pulled someone over, his tone carried a hint of mockery. If they argued, he'd raise his voice, not because they were dangerous, but because he could. He knew the law better, and that made him feel untouchable. Even his colleagues noticed, though most stayed silent. They respected him, or maybe they feared what speaking out might bring. He had a reputation for being firm, even intimidating. He liked that people were a little afraid of him. It made him feel larger than life. And yet beneath that pride there was a quiet emptiness he rarely admitted to himself. Years of dealing with lies and crime had hardened him, made him suspicious of everyone. He stopped seeing people as people. They were either troublemakers or potential threats. The uniform had become his shield, and he didn't know who he was without it. One afternoon, a call came through about a disturbance at a local apartment complex. It was the kind of call he thought of as routine: neighbors arguing, loud voices, nothing serious. He arrived expecting to settle things quickly. When he knocked on the door, it was opened by a woman who looked calm but tired, as if she had already had too many long days in her life. Her tone was polite but distant when she spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look scared. She simply explained that the situation had been exaggerated. He didn't like her tone. There was something in her eyes, steady, confident, that rubbed against his ego. He was used to people stumbling over their words when he appeared, eager to prove their innocence. But she spoke to him as an equal, not as someone intimidated by the badge. He asked questions, she answered carefully. Nothing about her was disrespectful, yet her calmness irritated him. When he asked to look around, she hesitated, asking if he had a warrant. The question struck him like a slap. In that moment, he decided she was being difficult. That small resistance challenged everything he believed about his authority. After he left, he couldn't stop thinking about her face. That composed expression, those measured words. It wasn't defiance exactly, it was dignity. And that for him was worse. He told himself he'd make sure she understood who was in charge next time. He even mentioned the incident to a fellow officer later, joking that some people needed to be reminded who kept the peace. The other man laughed, but there was a trace of discomfort in his eyes. Weeks passed, but his mind kept circling back to her. When a report involving her name appeared again, something about a neighbor dispute, he took it upon himself to handle it personally. Maybe it was curiosity or maybe pride, but he wanted to be the one to fix it. He visited her again, this time less friendly. His questions were sharper, his tone more commanding. She remained calm. She didn't argue, but she didn't yield either. She simply said, "I know my rights." The words echoed in his head long after he left. To him, those 4 words sounded like an insult. He had spent his whole life enforcing rights, upholding the law, and now this woman dared to remind him of it, as if he didn't already know. His pride turned into annoyance, and that annoyance soon grew into obsession. He started to see her as a problem that needed solving, someone who questioned his control. It wasn't about the case anymore. It was about winning. His co-workers began to notice his short temper. He snapped during briefings, dismissed advice, and took over cases that weren't even assigned to him. People whispered that he'd been under stress lately, but no one confronted him directly. He still had influence, and he used it. The woman, meanwhile, carried on with her life. She didn't try to provoke him or fight back directly. She simply lived quietly with a kind of strength that didn't need to be loud. But she kept records, dates, times, small notes of every visit, every conversation, every subtle overreach of authority. She didn't do it out of revenge, but out of self-protection. She knew the power imbalance too well, and she wasn't about to let herself be cornered. One day, he filed a minor complaint against her, citing non-cooperation. It was a weak charge, built more on his bruised ego than on any real offense. Still, he believed the system would back him. It always had. He filled the paperwork with confidence, convinced she wouldn't have the courage or resources to fight back. But she did. Instead of surrendering, she submitted her own written statement, clear and well-documented. She included the times he had shown up without proper notice, the moments he'd spoken out of line, even the parts where he'd tried to pressure her into signing forms she didn't understand. Her words were calm and factual. No anger, no exaggeration. Just truth. And truth, when presented plainly, can be more powerful than any accusation. When he read her statement later, he felt a strange unease creeping in. For the first time in years, he wondered if he'd gone too far, but pride pushed the thought away. He couldn't back down now. Backing down would mean admitting that he, the man who wore the badge, had made a mistake. He had spent his whole career telling others to own up to their actions, yet he couldn't bring himself to do the same. As days went by, he found himself more irritable. Every small inconvenience felt like an insult. He began staying late at work, pacing in his office, replaying conversations in his mind. He told himself that the woman was manipulating things, twisting the story. He needed to prove she was wrong. He needed to prove that he still had control. But the more he tried to push back, the more resistance he faced, not just from her, but from within the system. A few superiors started asking questions. Internal Affairs quietly requested files. A journalist called the department about an ongoing complaint. The walls that had protected him for years began to feel thin. He could sense it, though he didn't want to admit it. His invincibility was cracking. Outside the station, life continued as normal. People still waved when they saw him in uniform, unaware of the storm gathering behind his calm expression. He smiled back, but inside he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. Not fear of danger, but fear of being exposed. Fear of losing the identity he had built around that badge. One evening, he sat in his car outside the apartment complex where it had all started. Lights glowed in the windows. Somewhere up there, she was probably reading or making dinner, living her life as if nothing had changed. He wanted to believe he was the hero in this story, but deep down he knew something had shifted. The woman wasn't afraid of him, and that alone made him question everything he thought he knew about power. He stayed there for a long time, staring at the building, wondering how a single encounter could shake his confidence so deeply. Maybe he thought she wasn't the problem. Maybe it was him. But then pride rose again like an old habit. He straightened his shoulders, started the car, and drove away, telling himself he'd settle things once and for all. The badge gleamed faintly under the dashboard light, a small reflection of a man who still believed he was untouchable. What he didn't know was that the next few months would change everything. The small cracks in his confidence would soon widen into fractures that couldn't be ignored. The woman he underestimated, the one he saw as a mere inconvenience, was quietly preparing for a fight that would bring all his buried actions into the open. She wasn't loud. She didn't seek attention. But her quiet persistence would become the force that pulled him out from behind the shield of authority he had hidden behind for years. That night, he slept little. His dreams were restless, filled with echoes of voices, flashing lights, and the cold weight of his own badge pressing against his chest. When morning came, he looked in the mirror, adjusted his collar, and told himself everything was under control. But in some quiet corner of his mind, he already knew the truth. Control was exactly what he was losing. Days turned into weeks, and the case that should have faded quietly from his file kept coming back to his desk. Every time he thought it was closed, another piece of paper appeared, another message from Internal Affairs, another reminder that the woman he'd thought would simply disappear was not backing down. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He started avoiding certain people at the station. He did. And like the way some of his co-workers looked at him now, as if they knew something he didn't. The jokes had stopped. The friendly conversations had turned brief and distant. Even the morning coffee in the break room felt different. Too quiet, too polite. People were watching him, though no one said it out loud. He kept telling himself it was nothing. Just procedure. Complaints came and went all the time. But deep down, something about this felt different. This woman wasn't shouting in anger or throwing accusations without proof. She was patient, methodical, calm. She was doing everything the right way. And that made her dangerous in a way he had never faced before. At night, he tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't rest. He'd replay their encounters again and again, trying to find the moment when things had gone wrong. Maybe it was when she had asked him for a warrant. Maybe it was when she had said those words, "I know my rights." He'd heard that phrase hundreds of times before, but never like that. There was something in her tone that made it sound like a promise. He'd never liked losing. Since his early days in the academy, he'd built a reputation for being tough, decisive, and unwilling to back down. That attitude had helped him climb faster than most. But it also made him blind to the small mistakes, the times he'd crossed a line just because he could. The badge had become more than a symbol of authority. It was his identity. And now, for the first time, that identity was being challenged by someone he thought he could control. When the official notice arrived that the complaint had been escalated to a review hearing, he laughed at first. He told himself it would be a waste of time, that they'd read the reports, realize it was nothing, and close the file. But when he read the woman's written statement, his confidence slipped. She had every date, every time he had shown up, every unnecessary question, even the tone he had used. There were witnesses, neighbors who had seen the encounters, others who had noticed his repeated visits. She had built a wall of facts around him, and he had nothing but his word to push back with. He sat alone at his desk, reading her words over and over. The more he read, the more uneasy he felt. It wasn't that she was lying, she wasn't. Everything she described had happened. Maybe not with bad intentions, but it had happened exactly as she said. He realized how much of his behavior had become routine. Commanding, impatient, dismissive. Things that had once made him seem strong now made him look careless. For the first time in years, he felt small, but he quickly buried that feeling under anger. He told himself she was exaggerating, that she wanted attention, that she was trying to ruin his career for no reason. That story was easier to believe than the truth. He started showing up to work earlier, staying later, doing anything to keep busy. The longer he sat still, the louder his thoughts became. The silence of the office after hours felt heavy, almost accusing. He'd scroll through old reports, double-check procedures, trying to find something to prove that he'd done things by the book. But every time he tried to justify himself, the same uncomfortable thought came back. He hadn't. Then one afternoon, he saw her again. It wasn't planned. He was walking out of the courthouse after a routine hearing when he noticed her across the steps. She was standing with a small folder in her hands, talking to someone quietly. She didn't notice him at first. She looked calm, composed, focused. When she finally glanced his way, their eyes met for a brief moment. She didn't glare, didn't smile, didn't even flinch. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging that they were both part of something bigger than either of them had intended. That look unsettled him more than anger ever could. He wanted her to be emotional, to shout, to accuse him of something so he could defend himself. But she didn't. Her quietness felt heavier than words. It made him feel exposed. He turned away and walked quickly to his car, trying to shake the feeling that she already knew how this would end. In the following days, small things began to shift. His supervisor called him in for a routine discussion. The tone was polite but distant. They mentioned the complaint briefly, saying it was under review and that it was best to stay professional. He nodded and agreed, pretending not to notice the hint of doubt in their eyes. He had worked with these people for years, shared long nights and hard cases. Now they were treating him like a liability. He started avoiding the woman's name altogether. Whenever the subject came up, he'd change the topic or leave the room. But her name was everywhere, on forums and emails and whispers between colleagues. The more he tried to escape it, the more it followed him. The woman, on the other hand, seemed to move through the process with quiet determination. She never attacked him personally. She never went to the media or made a scene. She simply followed every step, every procedure, letting the truth build itself piece by piece. It was the kind of patience that unnerved people like him, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. As weeks passed, the department scheduled an internal review. He was called to give his side. Sitting across from a panel of familiar faces, he tried to explain himself. He said he'd acted within his duties, that he'd only been doing his job. His words were confident, but his voice lacked the usual firmness. The people in the room listened quietly, taking notes. No one nodded. No one smiled. When it was over, they thanked him and said they'd be in touch. That was all. When he stepped out of the room, his hands were trembling. He told himself it was just nerves. But deep down, he knew it was fear of losing not just his job, but his identity. For so long, he'd believed that the badge defined him. Without it, who would he be? Just another man, flawed and ordinary. The woman's side of the review was different. She came prepared, her documents neatly arranged, her tone calm and respectful. She didn't ask for pity. She simply told her story, how she had been treated, how she had felt, and why she had chosen to report it. Her honesty was her strength. Even the people who didn't want to take sides found it hard to ignore the quiet weight of her words. Outside the process, life went on as usual for most people. But for him, everything felt different. Every siren, every radio call reminded him of the one thing he might lose. He began to dread wearing the uniform. The badge that once gave him pride now felt heavy, almost like a burden. One night he drove aimlessly through the city streets. The flashing lights of the patrol cars ahead reminded him of who he used to be, the confident officer everyone respected. Now he felt like a shadow of that man. He parked by the side of a quiet street, turned off the engine, and sat in silence. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a protector. He felt like someone in need of protection, from himself, from the truth, from everything he had ignored for too long. He thought about the woman again. He wondered what gave her that quiet strength. Maybe it was something he had lost long ago, a belief in fairness and right and wrong without compromise. Somewhere along the way, he had replaced justice with control, and she had seen through it. When the notice came that the case would move to a formal hearing, he wasn't surprised. He had seen it coming, though he tried to convince himself otherwise. The words on the page blurred as he read them, his mind spinning with what-ifs. He imagined the courtroom, the questions, the evidence. He imagined facing her again, this time not as an officer, but as a man being held accountable. That night, he sat at his kitchen table long after midnight. The city outside was quiet, but inside his head, everything was loud. Memories of past cases flooded his mind. Moments when he had raised his voice, moments when he'd bent a rule, moments when he'd felt invincible. He realized how often he had mistaken fear for respect. People hadn't admired him. They had simply been too afraid to stand up to him, and now finally someone had. The next morning, he went to work early and sat in the parking lot, watching the sunrise over the station. He thought about walking inside and pretending everything was normal, but he couldn't. Something had changed inside him. He felt exposed, small and human in a way he hadn't felt in years. For once, he wasn't thinking about control or winning. He was thinking about consequences. He looked down at his badge resting on the seat beside him. It caught the sunlight for a moment, shining brightly, almost mocking him. He picked it up and turned it over in his hand, tracing the edges with his thumb. It had always been his shield, his proof that he mattered, but now it felt cold, almost foreign. He placed it back gently, started the car, and drove off, unsure of where he was going. He told himself he still had time to fix things, that the hearing would clear his name. But somewhere deep inside, he knew the truth. He had already lost something more valuable than the badge. He had lost the trust that came with it, and no court ruling could give that back. After that day at the apartment, something changed inside him. He didn't talk about it openly, but anyone who knew him could sense that something was off. He seemed distracted, irritated, and unusually restless. The confidence that once came so easily to him had turned into a quiet tension he couldn't shake. He told himself it was just another case, another routine incident, but deep down he knew it wasn't. That woman had gotten under his skin in a way no one ever had. He tried to carry on as normal. He woke up early, wonned his uniform, polished his badge until it gleamed, and went out on patrol. From the outside, everything looked the same, but on the inside, it was different. Every time he saw a woman walking confidently down the street, Every time he heard someone say the word rights, it bothered him. It reminded him of her. He didn't understand why. Maybe because for the first time in years someone hadn't backed down. He'd always believed that authority was meant to be respected without question. It was how he'd been trained. When someone challenged that authority, he saw it as a personal attack. He thought he was doing the right thing, keeping order, maintaining control. But what he didn't realize was that he'd stopped seeing people as people. They were problems to be managed, not lives to be understood. That woman had reminded him, without saying it directly, that he couldn't always be the one in charge. And he didn't like that feeling one bit. At the station, his colleagues noticed he was acting different. He was quieter than usual, shorter with his words, less friendly. Normally, he'd make jokes during briefings or tell stories from his patrols, but now he barely spoke. If someone mentioned that complaint, his face tightened and his jaw clenched. Most people took it as a sign to stop asking questions. He told himself that she'd eventually give up, that it was only a matter of time before the whole thing blew over. But instead, the opposite happened. She began following the process carefully, step by step, form by form, never missing a deadline, never raising her voice. It was the kind of persistence that didn't draw attention at first but slowly built momentum. Her complaint was now official. It had moved beyond his control. The department had assigned an internal review, and that meant people were starting to ask questions. At first, he wasn't worried. He had seen many complaints before, and most of them ended quietly. But when he got the notice that the woman's case had reached the next stage, he felt something tighten in his chest. She wasn't stopping. She wasn't afraid. He sat at his desk that evening, long after everyone had gone home. The light above him flickered as he read through the reports, trying to figure out where he could have gone wrong. To him, it was just a normal procedure. But the more he read her version of events, the more uncomfortable he became. Her words weren't dramatic or emotional. They were simple, clear, and truthful. That's what made them powerful. Every date, every time, every word he'd said. She had written them down. She had witnesses too, people who had heard the conversations, neighbors who had seen him visit again and again. For the first time, he began to realize how his actions might have looked from the outside. He wasn't used to thinking about things that way. In his world, intentions mattered more than appearances. But now those intentions were being questioned. He had always believed the badge protected him, that as long as he stood behind the law, he couldn't be wrong. Yet here he was, staring at a complaint that painted him as the very thing he had promised to fight against: unfairness. He didn't sleep much that night. When he closed his eyes, he kept seeing her face. Calm, steady, not angry, not scared, just certain. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. The next morning he drove to work earlier than usual. The streets were still quiet, the sun barely rising. He parked in the same spot as always and sat there for a while, watching his reflection in the mirror. The uniform that had once made him proud now made him uneasy. He tried to tell himself he'd be fine, that the system always protected its own. But this time a small voice in the back of his mind said otherwise. At the station, he noticed how conversation stopped when he entered the room. The laughter that usually filled the halls was replaced by awkward silence. He could feel eyes following him, though no one said anything. Rumors traveled fast, and though no one spoke openly, everyone knew what was happening. When he was finally called in to speak with his supervisor, the tone was formal. They said they needed to ask about recent conduct and the incident report. He tried to keep his answers short, confident, professional. He reminded them of his years of service, his record, his awards. But he could tell their expressions had changed. The respect that used to fill the room wasn't there anymore. There was distance now, official, polite, and cold. As he walked out of that meeting, his confidence began to crack. For the first time, he realized that maybe his badge didn't make him untouchable. Maybe he'd taken it too far. But instead of facing that truth, he did what he'd always done. He blamed the other person. "She's just trying to make a name for herself," he told one of his co-workers later. "You know how people twist things." But even as he said it, He didn't fully believe it. He could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. That woman wasn't trying to make a name for herself. She didn't seek attention or revenge. She just wanted fairness. And that was exactly what made her different. Days passed, and he began to feel the weight of the investigation. The smallest things started to bother him. He avoided social gatherings, skipped lunches with his team, and spent most of his breaks sitting alone. He could sense people whispering when he wasn't looking. He tried to brush it off, but it ate away at him quietly. One afternoon, he was out on patrol when he saw her again. She was walking down the street carrying a folder, looking calm as ever. Their eyes met for a brief second. He didn't know what to do. Wave, nod, look away. He chose the last option and turned down another road. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something closer to shame, though he didn't want to call it that. He told himself he still had control, that the truth would come out in his favor. But deep down, he could feel his world changing. The system that once felt like his shield was now becoming something else, something unpredictable. A week later, he was notified that the department had scheduled a formal review. It wasn't a court yet, just an internal hearing, but it meant things were serious. He spent nights preparing, rehearsing what to say. He practiced his tone, made notes, and tried to anticipate every question. Still, nothing could calm the storm building inside him. The day of the review, he walked in wearing his best uniform. He stood tall, trying to look confident. But as soon as he saw the panel in front of him, people he'd worked with for years, he felt a strange distance. They weren't colleagues today. They were investigators. He gave his statement, explaining how he'd followed procedure, how he'd only been doing his job. He talked about public safety, responsibility, and duty. But even as he spoke, he could feel the words falling flat. The expressions around the table remained unreadable. No one interrupted him. No one nodded. When he finished, they thanked him and said they'd take it under review. It was a phrase he'd used countless times himself. He knew exactly what it meant, nothing good or bad, just waiting. Waiting for someone else to decide your fate. He left the room with a knot in his stomach. The hallway outside felt colder than usual. As he walked past other officers, he kept his head down. For the first time in his life, he felt what so many others had felt standing in front of him, powerless. That night, he drove home in silence. The radio stayed off. The city lights passed by like ghosts. When he parked outside his house, he didn't go in right away. He just sat there, staring at the badge pinned to his chest. It had once been the most important thing in his life. Now it felt heavy, not physically, but in meaning. He began to wonder when things had started to go wrong. Was it the first time he'd raised his voice at someone who didn't deserve it? The first time he'd looked the other way when a mistake was made? Or was it the moment he believed that the badge made him bigger than the people he was supposed to serve? He didn't have the answers. He only knew that the woman he'd tried to intimidate had done something he never expected. She made him look at himself. And that scared him more than any case he had ever worked on. The next few days passed slowly. Every morning felt heavier than the last. He tried to convince himself it would all work out, but deep down he knew it wouldn't. Things had gone too far. The story had left the station walls. People were talking, online, in the local paper, even outside the courthouse. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, but pride wouldn't let him stop. He still believed he could fix it if he just fought harder. What he didn't realize was that the harder he fought, the more he was digging his own hole. The woman, meanwhile, stayed steady. She didn't attack him publicly or celebrate his downfall. She simply stayed true to the process, step by step, letting truth do what truth always does. It finds its way out. And as he sat alone one night, staring at the papers scattered across his table, he realized something he never wanted to admit. She wasn't his enemy. She was just the first person brave enough to stand up to him. And that, more than anything, was what broke the illusion he had lived under for years. The badge no longer felt like power. It felt like a mirror, showing him a version of himself he didn't want to see. The day of the hearing arrived with a chill in the air, though it wasn't winter. The officer woke up early, as he had always done before court appearances. But that morning, he felt something different, something heavier than the usual sense of authority he carried with him. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but an uneasy weight in his chest. He told himself it was just another case. He had been to court hundreds of times before, faced witnesses, lawyers, and even the occasional journalist. He always came out untouchable, but this time, something told him that the day wouldn't go like all the others. He stood before the mirror, straightening his uniform, checking that every button was polished and the badge gleamed under the light. That badge had always been his shield, his proof that he was someone who mattered. It reminded him that he had power, authority that most people couldn't question. But for the first time, as he stared at his reflection, he wondered if the badge meant as much as he thought it did. At the courthouse, people greeted him with the same respect they always had. Some nodded, some offered polite smiles, and others moved aside when he walked through. He felt a faint surge of confidence, reminding himself that this was his world. He knew how things worked here. He knew the system. And yet, when he saw the woman sitting calmly near the front of the courtroom, a quiet focus in her eyes, that confidence flickered. She didn't look scared or angry. She looked ready. Her posture was straight, her hands folded on the table, her expression steady. She wasn't the same woman he had tried to intimidate before. Something in her had changed. She carried a strength that came from preparation, from knowing the truth was on her side. As the judge entered, the room fell silent. The officer sat tall, pretending to be calm. The lawyers exchanged brief glances, papers rustled, and then the questioning began. At first he answered easily, repeating the same confident tone he always used when testifying. But soon the woman's attorney began asking questions that dug deeper than he expected. Dates, reports, statements, every detail had been carefully gathered, and for the first time he realized they had more evidence than he imagined. She had recorded everything, every meeting, every message, every step he thought she wouldn't dare challenge. He shifted in his seat, his throat dry, trying to keep his voice steady. He told himself he was still in control. He had his story, his years of service, his badge. But piece by piece, her side started building a picture that didn't look good for him. Each time she looked at him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: accountability. She didn't need to shout or accuse him. She let the facts speak. The courtroom listened, the judge listened, and even those who once admired him began to see the cracks in the man they thought they knew. The officer's lawyer tried to push back, claiming that she had misinterpreted his actions, that it was all just a misunderstanding. But the woman remained calm, answering every question clearly. She spoke softly but firmly, her voice never shaking. Her honesty made an impact that no legal argument could undo. As the day went on, the courtroom became a place where his past started to surface. A few old cases were brought up, incidents that once seemed buried. Patterns appeared, showing how he had used his authority to silence people before. Things that were ignored now looked different in the light of her evidence. He could feel the eyes on him, some from the audience, some from his own colleagues sitting at the back. He wondered what they were thinking. Did they still believe in him, or were they already distancing themselves, preparing to forget his name if things went wrong? During a short break, he stepped outside, leaning against the hallway wall. He could hear the faint buzz of people whispering, the click of shoes on the polished floor. For a moment, he felt like a stranger in the very building where he once walked like a king. He remembered all the times he had walked through these halls feeling untouchable. Now every sound echoed differently. Every face seemed to watch him with quiet judgment. He caught his reflection in a window, still in uniform, still carrying the badge, but something about it looked smaller now. Less powerful, almost fragile. When the hearing resumed, the woman took the stand again. Her testimony was simple, direct, and powerful. She didn't exaggerate, didn't dramatize. She told the truth, detail by detail, about what had happened and how she refused to stay silent. Her words filled the courtroom, not with anger, but with something stronger: dignity. The officer tried to look unaffected, but his jaw tightened as she spoke. Each sentence was like a mirror held up to him, showing parts of himself he never wanted to see. He thought of all the years he had used his authority to keep control, to stay respected, to make sure people feared him more than they questioned him. But sitting there, hearing her voice, he felt small. When it was his turn to respond, his words didn't carry the same force they used to. The room no longer leaned toward him the way it once did. He tried to sound confident, to remind everyone of his years of service, of all the good he had done. But his voice sounded tired, and his words didn't erase what had already been shown. The judge listened quietly, taking notes. No one interrupted, no one smiled. The silence in the room felt heavy, and every pause stretched too long. He could feel the weight of his own choices pressing down. As the session ended for the day, the woman stood up, collected her files, and walked out without looking back. He watched her go, realizing that no amount of rank or reputation could change what had happened. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what would happen next, and it terrified him. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, cameras flashing as both sides exited. He tried to keep his head down, walking past them quickly, but he could hear snippets of their questions. "Do you have anything to say about the allegations? Do you believe the court is being fair?" He didn't answer. He didn't even look up. The attention that once made him proud now felt suffocating. That night he sat alone in his living room, the badge still resting on the table. He stared at it for a long time, remembering what it used to mean. It had been his pride, his purpose, but now it reminded him of everything he might lose. The walls around him felt smaller, the silence deeper. He thought about calling someone, an old colleague, a friend, but he couldn't think of anyone who'd still stand beside him. The next few hearings unfolded slowly. Each one chipped away at his defense, revealing more truth than he wanted the world to see. He learned how fragile respect could be when built on fear. He began to understand that people only admired him because they didn't know the full story. Now they did. And once people see the truth, they can't unsee it. The woman remained calm through it all. She never gloated, never raised her voice. Even when things got tense, she focused on facts, not emotion. Her quiet courage made an impression on everyone in the courtroom. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had been too afraid to stand up before. By the third week, the case had become local news. People debated it in coffee shops, in offices, and online. Some defended him, saying he'd served for years and deserved respect. Others said this was long overdue, that no one should have unchecked power. The more attention the story got, the more isolated he felt. He stopped wearing his uniform outside of court. He didn't like the looks people gave him now, some curious, some disappointed, others angry. It was as if the badge, once a symbol of authority, had turned into a mark of shame. One afternoon, after another long day in court, he sat in his car for nearly an hour before driving home. The courthouse parking lot was almost empty, and the sky was painted in fading shades of orange and gray. He thought about the years he spent believing he could control every outcome. Now control was slipping away, one truth at a time. He couldn't sleep that night. The same thoughts kept circling his mind. How did it come to this? When did he start believing he was untouchable? Was there ever a moment he could have stopped, turned around, done things differently? But the answers didn't come. All he could do was stare at the ceiling and listen to the quiet ticking of the clock. The next morning when he returned to court, something in him had changed. He no longer walked with the same confidence. The woman noticed it too. She didn't smile, but there was a certain understanding in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement that the truth was finally catching up. During the final phase of questioning, his lawyer tried to soften his image, asking him to speak about his dedication, his years of service, his sacrifices. But even as he spoke, he knew it sounded hollow. The court had already seen too much. They had seen the reports, the records, the evidence. The truth no longer depended on what he said. It stood on its own. When the judge announced that the final decision would come soon, the officer nodded quietly. He didn't protest or argue. Deep down, he already knew what was coming. The truth had stripped away his shield, leaving him face to face with consequences he thought he'd never face. As he left the courtroom that day, the hallway felt longer than ever. Each step echoed. Each sound of his shoes reminded him of the authority he once commanded. But now he walked not as an officer above others, but as a man learning humility the hard way. Outside, the woman stood talking with her lawyer. She noticed him as he passed. For a brief moment, their eyes met, not with hatred, but with finality. She had fought for truth, and he had learned what truth really costs. He turned away, walking toward the exit as the noise of the city filled his ears. Somewhere behind him, doors closed, voices faded, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of being just another person. No badge, no protection, just a man facing the truth of his own making. The news about the courtroom case began spreading faster than anyone expected. It started with a few local journalists covering it as just another legal story, but soon it grew beyond the king. People started talking about it online, sharing clips and short reports giving their opinions about what had happened. Some called it bravery, others called it justice finally catching up. For the officer, it felt like his whole world was crumbling one headline at a time. Each morning he woke up hoping it would fade, that people would move on to the next big story. But every day it seemed to grow louder. He stopped answering phone calls, stopped checking the news, and avoided going out in public. The uniform that once made people greet him with respect now made them whisper when he passed. At the police department, the atmosphere had changed too. The same people who once stood beside him now avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Even the younger officers who once looked up to him now stayed quiet and distant. It was as if the entire building had turned cold. He tried to convince himself that it was temporary, that once the final verdict came, people would realize he wasn't as bad as they thought. But deep down, a part of him knew that something inside him had broken long before this case. The court had only brought it into the light. One afternoon, his supervisor called him in. The tone was formal, polite, but distant. They spoke about procedure, about reputation, about the department needing to maintain public trust. The words were careful, but the message was clear. Until the case was fully resolved, he was being placed on temporary suspension. No badge, no gun, no duties. He sat there quietly, listening, his eyes fixed on the polished surface of the desk. The same desk where he had once stood tall, giving reports and receiving praise. Now he sat on the other side, powerless. When he handed over his badge, it felt heavier than ever before. The small piece of metal had defined his entire life. Giving it up felt like giving away his identity. As he walked out of the building, the sun hit his face, but he felt no warmth. Everything seemed quieter, slower. The city looked the same, but it didn't feel like home anymore. That night he sat in his living room, the television off, the curtains closed. His phone buzzed every few minutes, some messages of support, some from people asking for his side of the story. He ignored them all. He didn't know what to say anymore. For years, words had been his weapon, sharp, controlled, confident. Now none of them felt right. Across town, the woman who had taken him to court lived her life with the same calm determination she had shown from the beginning. She never spoke to the media, never bragged or sought attention. When a reporter came to her door, she politely said she had nothing more to add. She wanted peace, not fame. Her quiet dignity only made the public respect her more. Inside, though, she still felt the weight of it all. It wasn't easy standing up to someone with power. She had faced sleepless nights, moments of doubt, and the fear that things might not change. But now, as she watched the truth come to light, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Not happiness, but relief that she had done the right thing. When the next court session came, the atmosphere was tense. Reporters lined the steps, cameras flashed, and the crowd outside seemed larger than before. The officer walked in quietly, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Gone was the confident stride he once had. He no longer looked like the man who believed he owned the room. Inside, the hearing was shorter than before. Most of the arguments had already been made. The final pieces of evidence were presented, the final statements given. Then the judge announced that the decision would be delivered soon. The words hung in the air like a bell tolling in the distance. He nodded, trying to keep his face expressionless. The woman sat still, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She didn't look at him. There was nothing left to say between them. Everything had already been said in the open. Days turned into weeks as they waited for the verdict. The officer found himself restless, walking in circles in his small apartment. Without the job, without the routine, he didn't know what to do with his time. The silence became unbearable. He started thinking about the moments that had brought him here, the small choices that didn't seem wrong at the time but added up to something ugly. He remembered the pride he used to feel when people respected him, how he believed the badge gave him authority to decide what was right. Somewhere along the way, that pride had turned into arrogance. He realized he had stopped listening to people, stopped seeing them as human beings. To him, they were just names on reports, cases to close, until he met someone who refused to be treated that way. Meanwhile, the woman tried to move forward with her life. She returned to work, spent time with her family, and slowly allowed herself to breathe again. But she knew the story wasn't over yet. The verdict would not only decide his fate, it would send a message to everyone watching. When the final day came, the courtroom was packed. People filled every seat, and even more stood near the back, waiting to hear what the judge would say. The officer sat quietly, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the floor. The woman sat across from him, steady as ever. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The decision was read slowly, carefully. As the words came out, the officer felt the ground shift beneath him. The verdict went against him. His actions were officially recognized as misconduct. The ruling was clear. His position would be terminated, and further investigation would determine if other penalties would follow. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then the judge stood, and everyone began to rise. The officer didn't move. He stayed seated, staring straight ahead. He had known this moment might come, but hearing it out loud still cut deep. The badge that once symbolized everything he was had now been taken away, and not by force, but by truth. The woman quietly gathered her papers and left the courtroom. There was no celebration, no smile, just quiet satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions, but she kept walking, calm and silent. The officer stepped outside a few minutes later, greeted by the same chaos of cameras and voices. For the first time, no one moved aside for him. He was just another man in a suit lost in the crowd. He didn't answer any questions. He simply walked to his car, his face pale, his steps slow. That evening, news channels across the city played the story on repeat. Former officer found guilty of misconduct. His photo appeared on screens everywhere. For years, he had been known for his medals and service. Now he was known for his fall. At home, he turned off the TV and sat in silence. He thought about all the people he had met during his years in uniform. The ones who had thanked him, the ones who had feared him, and the ones he had dismissed without a second thought. He wondered what they would think now. Over the following weeks, life became very quiet. He received a few letters, some angry, some supportive, but most of his old colleagues kept their distance. It was easier for them to move on without him. He couldn't blame them. People forget quickly when it's convenient. He tried to look for other work, but every interview ended the same way. The moment they recognized his name, their tone changed. They thanked him for coming, then politely said they'd call if anything came up. They never did. He realized then that reputation once lost doesn't return easily, and respect built on fear isn't real respect. It's just silence waiting to be broken. One afternoon, as he sat at a small cafe near the edge of town, he overheard two people talking about the case. They didn't recognize him. One said, "It's good someone finally stood up to people like that." The other nodded. Yeah, sometimes power blinds people. They forget they're supposed to protect, not control. Their words stung, but they were true. He finished his coffee quietly and left without saying a word. At home, he looked around at the life he once thought was solid. The certificates on the wall, the photos in uniform, the awards. None of it brought him comfort anymore. It all felt like pieces of someone he used to be. For a while, he avoided looking at his old badge, which now sat inside a small box in the drawer. But one night, he took it out and held it in his hand. The metal was cold and dull, its shine long gone. He realized it had never truly made him powerful. It was supposed to remind him of duty, not dominance. He had forgotten that somewhere along the way. Meanwhile, the woman continued her quiet work in the background. She started helping others who had faced unfair treatment, guiding them on how to speak up and where to find help. She didn't want fame or money. She wanted change. Months passed. The story faded from the headlines, replaced by newer ones. But the people who had watched it unfold didn't forget. The case became a reminder that truth could still stand against power, that even one person could make a difference. For the officer, it was a slow process of reckoning. He spent his days reflecting, learning, and sometimes helping out at small community centers. No uniform, no authority, just trying to do something meaningful again. He wasn't looking for forgiveness anymore. He knew it had to be earned, not demanded. What he wanted now was peace, not the kind that comes from being respected, but the kind that comes from understanding. And though he never said it out loud, he knew that the woman he once tried to silence had given him something unexpected, a lesson that power means nothing without honesty. It was a painful lesson, but perhaps the most important one of his life.